Okay, so let's look at the next two phases in our project methodology, and that is the planning phase and the organizing phase. Now, I've clustered both of these together because just in the context of this unit, it just makes a lot more sense for us to talk about these together. The planning phase is the stage of the project where we really set out what needs to be done and when it's going to happen. And the organizing phase is really when we're breaking down and articulating our schedule. You know, what's going to happen, when's it going to happen, and what's the sequence of events that need to occur. Like what happens before what and what happens after what. So we'll just keep these two things together as we talk about this next stage of the project methodology. So the theory is that the scope is approved, we get sign off, it gets back to us as the person in charge, the project manager in this case, or the senior project officer, and we're responsible for now creating the plans. So we take the information from the scope and we now start to really extrapolate that information into some type of articulate roadmap on how we're going to get that done. So we need to identify major deliverables, major activities, and tasks that are going to drive those activities. We need to identify when these things are going to happen and who's going to do them and so forth. So we take the scope, we now start to develop plans, and this is a very consultative process. So again, depending on the nature of the project, depending on the nature of your workplace, depending the skill level of your project team and the stakeholders around you, will depend on how often and how deep we consult. But as a basis or as a rule of thumb, we really want to engage with the people around us, because the more appropriately experienced and competent voices, the greater the quality of the work that we're going to produce. So we start to set out what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. Now, I should say here, this is a critical component to the success of the project, because the data shows that there is a correlation between poor planning and poor project performance. So when you look at projects that have failed, you can also see that there is a history of poor planning for that project. So the more time we spend developing good, well-consulted, robust plans, the higher the likelihood of success, because we're actually starting to illuminate a little bit more what the future is going to look like in terms of how we're going to go about our project. And as a project manager, we're responsible for that. So we're responsible for identifying the activities that need to be done and then how to drive those activities. And all this needs to then go into a project plan. And again, different workplaces will have templates around what a project plan should look like and the information required. And your workplace is no different. You'll have probably a number of different templates depending on the type of project and the nature and the part of the business that it comes from. But typical elements within a project or components of a project plan are very similar to that of a scope, except they're fleshed out more. So you have things like a project purpose and a background, and sometimes you'll have the strategic context in there. You'll have things like how it fits in with the bigger picture priorities, how this ties in with some of our strategic priorities, for example. Then you'll have agreed project objectives in there and any sub-objectives. So sometimes they're actually broken down into subcategories. You'll have the scope in there, that is, what's in scope, what's out of scope, what are the deliverables that's going to come out of it. You'll also, in some cases, touch on the assumptions and constraints that you'll find in the scope. You'll also have governance in there, the project governance. So, for example, what are the key roles and responsibilities within the project? You'll have the stakeholders, who are they? You'll have the schedule, how we're going to execute this, what are the sequence of events? And most commonly you'll see that in terms of Gantt charts. If you're not familiar with Gantt charts, I'll show you an example shortly. But you also might have things like a critical path analysis or a CPA. And in some of the bigger projects, like if you're building submarines, for example, you'll have PERT charts and things like that, which I'm not going to go through today, but just to sort of say that sometimes you get far more sophisticated components and tools within the project plan. You'll have resources and cost plans, so you'll have a budget in there as well as a resource acquisition component. You'll have a risk management component, which will talk about the risk management strategy and will identify the major risks. And sometimes it even links to how the project risks link into other risks in the business. Sometimes within your project plan, it'll ask you to consider if this has any other flow-on effects to other risks or business operations, risks to other business operations. You'll have a comms plan in there in terms of what needs to be shared, who needs to receive it, how frequently and how. You'll have a quality management component to it, so standards, quality assurance, and quality control. So how do we check quality as we're doing some of these things within the project, and then how are we going to check quality at the end of it being produced or executed? It'll have procurement schedule, perhaps. It'll have controls that are going to be in place in terms of being able to monitor performance, and it'll have sometimes even protocols and procedures on how to manage variance or alterations to the baseline. Who has to be informed? Who has to authorize it? Who has to have their finger on the pulse and so forth? These are the typical. This is a range of potential components within a project plan, and depending on the workplace, how technical the planning process is, depending on the size of the project and the risks associated, would depend on how many of these components are included or which other ones that I haven't identified. The ones that are highlighted in yellow are the ones that are most common. So if we go back to that context I spoke about at the start of this discussion, and I said, look, really this unit is about us as managers or as senior people using project management methodology in our everyday practice when we're confronted with an enterprise or a task that we don't have much heritage in, or it's not business as usual. The components of this chart here that are highlighted in yellow, that'd be the typical components that we would include for a project of that kind of nature. Something that is not a huge project, but it's still important that we undertake this planning process, and it's still important that we articulate and document the planning process. And we would put together a project plan, and it would be a pretty efficient streamline. So we'd perhaps only touch on purpose, background, the objectives, what's in scope, what's out of scope, what are the deliverables, what's the governance framework, who are the stakeholders, what's going to be the schedule, what are the resources including budgets, and what's the risk assessment, and what's the comms plan. They're the critical components, the most typical elements that you would find that in most cases you would find that it wouldn't be reasonable to exclude any of those highlighted ones. So if I was to articulate it in terms of the 6 main steps, I would say these are the 6 main steps. You would develop the first draft of the project plan, or a draft of the project plan, and as part of that, you would think about things such as using the work breakdown structure, identifying what are the key deliverables and what are the activities and tasks. And I'll talk more about the work breakdown structure shortly. So you would develop that draft of your plan. You would, as part of that, then plot the project schedule. And the schedule is really about taking those activities and actions that you identified in the work breakdown structure and then thinking about the sequence of events. So in what order do these things need to occur, and putting it into some type of communication tool that is user-friendly. Then you conduct a risk assessment and develop a good risk management plan. So what are things that can go wrong, and how seriously do we take those, and what do we think are the consequences and likelihood? And we put together a budget. So once we've done our plan, we've done our schedule, we've done our risk assessment, we can really start to get a grip in terms of what's this thing going to cost us. And importantly, as part of that, when are those costs going to be incurred, because sometimes the cash flow becomes really important, and I'll talk more about that later. And then we consult with the team. So and we may have already been consulting with the team through all these steps, but this is a pretty important formal process in terms of we've done the draft and now we need to get some legitimate feedback in terms of how robust do we think this is? Have we got everything? Have we missed anything? Should we go back and reconsider anything? And this might be, and then from the consultation, we may go back through some of those steps a few more times before we get it right. And once we get it right, we finalize it. So that's a general 6-step process. And again, depending on the nature of the project and the size and the context and stakeholders and risks and so forth, you may have more steps in there, or you may condense some of those. For example, you may we're just going to do a plan. We don't necessarily have to invest too much into the Gantt or the schedule component, because it's a fairly simplistic process that we're undertaking. And it's the same with the risk management. There may not necessarily be too much of a risk context to this, and we've got a fairly good appetite for risk. So we're going to perhaps just do those first 3 steps together and so forth. So it can be adjusted according to the context, but generally speaking, if we talk about best practice, these are the main 6 steps for developing a project plan.